My guest today is Mike Freer. Since 2010, Mike has been the Conservative MP for Finchley and Golders Green, and on the 28th of January of this year, Mr. Freer announced his decision to not stand for a re-election to Parliament at the next general election, citing intolerable stress that he and his family have been enduring from the several serious threats that he has received to his personal safety, including a recent arson attack at his constituency office. While the motivation behind the arson attack is not yet clear, what is known is that Mr. Freer, who represents a constituency that includes one of the country's largest Jewish communities, has long been violently targeted by Islamist radicals and other extremists over his views on matters of Jewish interest, and has most recently observed that there is an underlying anti-Semitic part of the attacks. Regardless of one's political views, it should be deeply alarming to all people who care about our democracy that such fears are not only valid, but can reach the point of driving elected MPs like Mr. Freer out of public service. Mike, thank you for joining me. How are you doing?
Okay, yes, it's a bit calmer this week than it was when I announced I was standing down at the next election.
Yeah, I can imagine it is. I mean, we were all, frankly, appalled at the recent arson attack and relieved that neither you nor anyone from your staff were injured. How are your family and yourself dealing with the sort of stress at the moment?
Well, I mean, in terms of that was the final straw, in terms of obviously the individuals who set the fire are in prison awaiting trial. And because it's a live case, we have to be quite careful what we say. Not least as I'm actually the courts minister. Not that I am able to intervene. There are obviously very strict rules. But we do need to be careful because it's a live case. Until they actually go to court and present their defence, then obviously we don't know what the motivation is. But irrespective of the motivation, the fact that they set fire to my office was really the final straw for my husband Angelo. I mean, we'd had repeated what I would call low-level incidents over the years, whether it's graffiti, a mock Molotov cocktail left on the doorstep, basically someone urinated on the front door, that kind of stuff we take on the chin. But as you know, I've had a couple of run-ins with Muslims against Crusades, who made a very unsubtle threat to come and stab me. And then, of course, Harbi Ali, the man that went on to murder David Amos, came to Finchley first. And luckily, just pure luck, I wasn't in Finchley that day, as I had been planning to. So all things combined in terms of low level and slightly more serious, Angela, my husband, had just said, that's enough. Wasn't prepared to keep putting up with, having to worry, am I going to survive a day if I'm having to go out to work wearing a stab vest? Or am I just going to be attacked walking home from the tube? And so, whilst members of Parliament, to a degree, we don't quite sign up to what we have to put up with, but there's an element of that's democracy. But our families do not sign up for it. I mean, certainly I've had one or two emails who said, it's outrageous you stepping away. That's your job. And I'm going, well, it might be my job, but it's not my husband's job to worry if I'm going to survive. So the arson attack really was the final straw.
Yeah, of course. And, you have endured high level of abuse for years now. And I have to ask you, how do you and your husband manage this level of stress while also going about and living your life? Are you able to walk around without worrying?
Yeah.
And just...
Well, half the time I never told him. It was just
Right.
easier not to let him know everything that happened. Interestingly, as you probably know, we had a slightly threatening phone call the day I decided to step down. The police locally were very good and they arrested him the next day. He did have a bit of a track record with us, having previously made threats, and I sent over a copy of the tweet to Angelo saying, great news, he'd been arrested, without realising this is one incident I hadn't told Angelo about. So managing the stress is largely containing things and not trying to unduly worry him and the rest of the family, because most of the time it's just people venting, people with mental health issues, but you're never quite sure whether someone just shouting at you can turn ugly. And certainly what I'd noticed, the level of anxiety that Angelo was clearly feeling had gone up. So as you probably know, we'd had a knife attack in Golders Green last week or the week before, which eventually the police described as a hate crime. It took them a day to determine that someone waving a knife in a Jewish shop shouting anti-Semitic attacks was a hate crime. A little slow off the mark. Angelo basically said, see, I told you, only takes one. And that's always the worry. If you like, the organised groups are slightly easier to deal with because they tend to be monitored. They tend to be under the watch of, whether it's the police or the security services. It's the individuals that you're never quite sure. I mean, certainly Harbi Ali was radicalised in his bedroom, or someone with mental health issues can be living around the corner, and that's where the risk is. You're just never quite sure what's going to be around the corner when you're on the street, so you just have to deal with it.
You mentioned Harbi Ali there. Now, 2.5 years ago, of course, the MP Sir David Amos was horrifically murdered by the then 25-year-old Islamist Harbi Ali, and it was revealed during the court case that he had actually visited your constituency 1 month before he assassinated Sir David, and it was only by pure chance that you weren't in your office that day. How did hearing that make you feel?
Well, I remember, obviously, David had been tragically murdered, and then the police investigation obviously was quite swift. I literally had a police officer from the counter-terrorism unit come to see me and explain to me that as part of the investigation they'd realised he targeted Finchley. He'd come up apparently and done several recces, and had come up on that day, and he told the police armed with intention to hurt me. MPs have a bit of gallows humour. We try and shrug these things off, but I'm told that I did look quite ashen, and when you do kind of, then it sinks in. It was after that you just realise he'd been hanging around the office. We've always had strong security at the office. It was Mrs. Thatcher's office, so we've always had quite high levels of security. So we'd never allowed walk-ins off the street. It was always by appointment only. But in between appointments, I'd frequently run across the road, get a can of Coke or a coffee from the deli, and that's where he's hanging around. And so when you realise, actually, the attack on the office would have been quite rare because it's a bit of a fortress, but it's when you're literally going about, just walking to the shop, that's when you're vulnerable. And so now, when I do advertise, if I'm doing what I call a supermarket surgery, where I stand at the door, let people come and talk to me, I wear a stab vest. Or where twice a year I do advice fairs for over 55s and then get 300-400 residents come in and talk to various organisations. Again, because I'm publicly accessible, people can kind of walk in. That's where I wear the stab vest. But frankly, you're more at risk walking to the tube, going to the supermarket, and that's the bit you can never really get used to.
And I suppose it means you can never really relax. And I have to ask you, with what has happened to you and the death threats that other MPs from across the House have received, not to mention the murders of Sir David Amos and Joe Cox, do you think that enough is being done to protect MPs? I mean, what more could the authorities be doing, do you think?
What's been quite interesting is how many colleagues have contacted me and say they've had death threats and the individual is now in prison. I've been staggered, but I mean, in 1 week, 4 MPs told me they'd had death threats and the individual was in prison. And I felt like, well, why didn't I know about that? I think the call for more security is missing the point, because our homes and our offices are very secure. I don't agree with giving us close protection or giving us government cars, because, or even frankly having a security guard in your advice surgery, because that ability to be accessible to the public, holding surgeries in libraries and so on, is a fundamental part of our democracy. You do have to be aware. So I had to stop doing surgeries in 2 of my libraries because there was only one route in and out. So you're taught now that you have to have 2 exits, an exit that you can have behind you to escape. So you can do sensible measures to keep ourselves accessible. But the fundamental issue is, in my view, there's possibly 3 things that we need to address. One is social media. There are things on social media that should not be there. So I saw the 7/10 massacre footage, and that was in a controlled environment. There are things I saw on that footage I never want to see again. but it's on the internet, and it desensitizes people. It makes it feel it's acceptable, it's normal. Then, of course, when you complain, very little happens. If anything at all, it's very slow. The other thing we need to do is actually ensure that we teach people to check facts. These days, it seems to be, if it's on social media, it must be true. And that level of fact checking seems to have diminished. And that's something we need to go back in teaching people, get 2 sources, 3 sources, make your own view rather than just accepting things at face value. And then the big challenge is that this is for the Met. My local police have been amazing. They've given me huge levels of support after the arson attack, police patrols, police car outside my house on a regular basis. But in London, central London, particularly during the demonstrations, we are not seeing a visible deterrent for what people are clearly breaking the law. And in my view, the police need to do less videoing and arresting at a later date. If arrests, in fact, do take place, they need to be arresting on the spot, visibly on the spot, so that other people in that march, that demonstration, see the consequences. People watching on television see the consequences of when you overstep the mark. At the moment, you can see things happening and nothing appears to happen. And so it would send the green light to other people to simply copy, wearing costumes of Hamas terrorists, saying that Hitler was right. That is not acceptable, and people need to stop it at the time, not 2 weeks later.
Well, exactly. And since the 7th of October, Labour MPs have been especially targeted and intimidated by anti-Israel activists because they chose not to vote for a ceasefire between Israel and Hamas in Parliament. Now, Angela Rayner, the deputy leader of the Labour Party, for example, recently spoke about how these threats were negatively impacting her. I want to ask you, how do you feel about how MPs are currently being treated by anti-Israel activists?
Well, it's a level of intimidation, and interesting. One of my colleagues had a crowd of 70 people outside of his house last night, and the police were slow to respond. And when they did respond, they said it was a peaceful protest. Well, it might have been peaceful, but if you've got 70 people chanting outside of your house, not your office, outside of your house, I don't believe that is acceptable. I don't want to curtail anybody's right to demonstrate. But I think outside someone's home, where their family is, particularly this colleague has, youngish children, it's intimidation. It is not about trying to get your point of view across. It is about trying to intimidate people to change their views or silence them. And I think that is what we need to do is we need to ensure that this is not, people understand this is not acceptable. And whether that's a Labour colleague, doesn't matter what party you're in, that people screaming and baying for blood or accusing you of having blood on your hands is designed to silence you. Robust debate is right, intimidation is wrong.
Exactly. And, as we've said, you're no stranger to intimidation yourself. Now, regarding the threats and acts of intimidation carried out against you, you have said that, I'm going to quote you here, you said that there is an underlying anti-Semitic part of the attacks. Did you realize early on, as the MP for Finchley and Golders Green, that standing firmly with your Jewish constituents and speaking out about what you feel is right would result in you experiencing anti-Semitism or being targeted by anti-Semites, even though that you yourself are not Jewish?
I didn't expect, if you like, the threat of violent attack. I didn't expect to have my life put in danger. I always knew that you'd get robust challenge. I mean, actually, it doesn't really matter what your views are as a member of Parliament. I mean, I stood up and I was part of having residential squatting made a criminal offence. And I had a level of demonstrations outside my office from a group that thought squatting was legitimate. That's par for the course, and anybody is entitled to come and try and change my views. I didn't expect to be targeted by people who've been radicalised, and clearly that radicalisation was, and particularly Muslims Against Crusades, thought I was Jewish. And so that ability to come and attack me either physically or with threats of taking my life, was based on their view that either I was a supporter of the Jewish community, a supporter of Israel, or that I was Jewish myself. And so clearly there was a level of anti-Semitism, because we all know that much of the debate about Israel these days isn't about the actions of the Israeli government, and criticising the Israeli government is perfectly legitimate. I do it myself. Being a friend of Israel doesn't mean that we can't be critical, but when you want to seek the country to be wiped out, that's when it's clearly anti-Semitic. And so clearly there is a level of anti-Semitism in the attacks that I've had to suffer.
Mm. Now, you first became a target of the proscribed organization Muslims Against Crusades in 2011 after it was made public about your role in obstructing the entrance into the UK of the radical anti-Semitic Arab-Israeli cleric Sheikh Raed Salah. Now, Muslims Against Crusades carried out a campaign of online intimidation by posting a picture of you on their website with the message, "Let Stephen Trims be a warning," referencing the stabbing of the MP Stephen Trims by an extremist constituent during his surgery in East London earlier that year. Members of Muslims Against Crusades followed up their online threats by making an appearance at a constituency meeting you were holding at the North Finchley Mosque in October 2011, disrupting events and calling you a, quote, Jewish homosexual pig who was defiling the house of Allah. You said at the time, what we must also do is ensure that any new incarnation of this group continues to be monitored, because past history tells us that this group does reform, rename, and reappear. My question to you now is, to what extent are you concerned that individuals who are members of such groups can just carry on as before under different banners?
Well, I think there's a lot of the security apparatus we don't get to see. So I know that a couple of certainly the main ringleader of Muslim Against Crusades has been into prison at least once. And I know that one of the other key activists of Muslim Against Crusades was a convert. And he was outside the North Finchley Mosque, which I have to say were mortified at what happened. And certainly the North Finchley Mosque has always been welcoming, and actually does a lot of work with other faith groups. And this group did not represent them. And I think there's a very big difference between those who are radicalised and many ordinary Muslims who simply want to get on with their lives. What I found is that certainly the first time the guy behind us had been in and out of prison is clearly being monitored by the security services. The second advice surgery, the police were there at that time, and the ringleader there was a convert, and he's also been into prison. So many of the individuals will be under surveillance, even if the group is no longer active, or don't appear to be part of a organised group, because they become known to the security services. Then I have no doubt that they remain under some form of surveillance. So that gives me some comfort. The bit is, the gap in the fence is where you get an individual that's radicalised online. Now, a lot of people are monitored because obviously there's quite a lot of sophisticated technology that can monitor what websites and words being searched to send up a red flag. But the sheer volume does mean that sometimes, only takes one to slip through the net, as we saw with David Amos. So the organised groups and the people involved, I'm pretty confident that they are being surveilled. The individuals radicalised, that's the bit that gives me pause for thought, because we just don't know how many there are, and they're so easy to go under the radar if they're basically sat in their mum and dad's bedroom on the internet.
Yeah, and that really is the danger of the social media can present. Now, let me ask you a question that I ask all of our guests. If someone who is not Jewish wants to help in the fight against anti-Semitism, where should they start?
Well, they start by ensuring that they show support in a variety of ways. Turn up on the marches, but can I just say something to the community? When you're advertising marches or events, please tell the wider community. So I've seen some things organised in central London, and I'm going, I didn't know about that, or I've got like 5 days' notice. There's been the padlocks on with the Bridge of Hope, is it, for the hostages? The first I kind of knew about it was like the day before. So there's a big piece of work to be done on advertising amongst friends to garner more support. But equally, it is showing support visibly on supportive marches and demonstrations. But also, I've said to all of my Jewish friends, is reach out to your neighbours. I mean, I get to go to the most wonderful evenings, for a Friday night supper, but open the doors to your neighbours. Invite them in. When I said I did some work with the Jewish Leadership Council about how few of my colleagues on the back benches understood the Jewish community, because most MPs don't have a Jewish community and therefore don't simply understand it because they're not exposed to the community. And so the community needs to open the doors. The schools need to open the doors. The synagogues need to open the doors, invite people in. And that's how we build bridges. It's how people get to understand what the community stands for. And as I've said many times, when you go into a Jewish school or you go into a synagogue, you'll suddenly realise this is the only school I go into that has security. It's the only place of worship I go into that has security. And seeing that day-to-day good side of all the community has to offer, but also the downside of what the community has to put up with, I think is a real opportunity for change and building friendships. So I would say throw open the doors, invite people in. With security.
My last question for you. Absolutely. My last question for you today is, what's next for Mike Freer, and where can people find you?
Well, I'm still the Member of Parliament until the next election. I do not plan to change my support for the community or Israel. I will just have to find a different way of doing it. So whilst, yes, I'm standing down as Member of Parliament, I'm not standing down as a supporter of the community and Israel. At this stage, I really have no idea. I've got to sit down. I've still got a mortgage to pay. So I've got to think about where do I go next to earn a living. But I hope that the community, particularly Finchley and Golders Green, will realise that I'm not deserting them.
Yeah. Mike, thank you very much for coming on Podcast Against Antisemitism.
Thank you. Very welcome. Be well.